One day, I found myself in a situation I could have never imagined. It all started with a routine doctor's visit. The day seemed entirely ordinary. I took my husband for his scheduled checkup, expecting nothing more than a confirmation of his current health. But that visit became a turning point in my life. Dr. Lawrence, a man who always seemed composed and professional, greeted us with unusual seriousness. His face was grim, his eyes filled with a stern focus. As he began to speak, I felt a wave of anxiety and panic rise within me. The news he shared turned my world upside down. What should have been a normal conversation turned into something terrifying. The doctor's words echoed in my mind, making my heart race. He was talking about my husband, the man I had cared for throughout his illness, the man I loved and supported through difficult times. But now, Dr. Lawrence was strongly advising me to consider my own safety. His suggestion to distance myself from my husband felt unbearable. My thoughts were filled with fear and uncertainty. How could I distance myself from someone with whom I had spent years, someone I had cared for and supported? My name is Brittany Blinden, and I'm 50 years old. For the past 10 years, I've worked at one of the leading pharmaceutical companies in our city. This place became my second home, giving me a sense of stability and security. Despite my age, I continue to work full-time, and I'm valued for my dedication and professionalism. I've always been known for my hard work and commitment, steadily earning the respect and admiration of my colleagues. Not many people my age can boast such a work ethic, but for me, it was a natural choice. My job gave me purpose and allowed me to feel needed. I had been alone for a long time until Morgan came into my life 4 years ago. Our relationship with Morgan began cautiously. He was older than me, had already gone through one divorce, and like me, wasn't interested in starting a family with children. We met through a marriage counseling service, both of us seeking more friendship than romance. Gradually, our communication grew into something more. We decided to keep our relationship a secret, not sharing our plans even with our closest friends and colleagues. One day, our manager Douglas, a man with whom I had a warm relationship, casually joked about marriage. His harmless comment could have been taken differently, but I knew it was just a joke. No one around us even suspected that shortly after, Morgan and I would decide to get married. Our wedding was modest, without grand ceremonies or celebrations. We simply signed the necessary papers at City Hall, and it felt symbolic in its own way, our quiet, measured decision to start a life together. The simplicity of the process surprised me, but at that moment, I felt joy and anticipation for our future together. However, now that Dr. Lawrence had opened my eyes to real threats, I faced a dilemma I was completely unprepared for. Morgan started working at a factory right after high school. It was his long-standing place of employment, where he spent many years, while my life took a different path. I grew up in an orphanage, and from childhood, I had dreamed of complete independence, of a life where I would be in control of my own destiny. That's why, even after Morgan and I got married, I didn't leave my job at the pharmaceutical company. For me, this job wasn't just a means of living, but a true passion, an embodiment of my ambitions and perseverance. When we tied the knot, the first person I shared the joyful news with was my manager, Douglas. He congratulated me, but I noticed a shadow of something more in his eyes, perhaps sadness or slight disappointment. Maybe he felt lonely, as it was I, his old friend, who had found happiness in marriage first. I tried to tease him a bit to lighten the mood, but he just brushed it off, and I realized it wasn't worth pursuing. Despite his mixed feelings, I was on cloud 9, entering this new chapter of my life with Morgan. We made plans for the future, imagining how our life together would unfold. But reality turned out to be far less glamorous than the dreams I had painted in my mind. Newlyweds, as it turned out, faced the same challenges and everyday routines as everyone else. In my case, not much changed. I continued working, the only significant change being our move to a more rural area and the need to drive to work instead of taking the usual bus. Morgan and I shared an old car since he didn't have one of his own. This transition to a new way of living went smoothly, but about a year after the wedding, everything began to change. Morgan, who had always been a source of calm and strength, started showing signs that something was wrong. He withdrew into himself, lost interest in ordinary things, stopped eating proper breakfasts, and his thoughts seemed to wander far away. On top of that, he started getting confused about the simplest things. Seasonings no longer tasted the same, and his clothes often didn't suit the occasion. These small oddities might have seemed insignificant at first, but with each passing day, they became more noticeable. Morgan grew quieter, both at work and at home. I had always appreciated his quiet strength, but now his silence felt painful, heavy. It filled the house with a strange sense of emptiness, and I began to realize that I was living as though I was alone. This loneliness crept up on me, like a cold draft sneaking through the cracks in the windows. Every day, I noticed new, albeit small, but significant changes in his behavior. At that moment, I realized that Morgan might be struggling with mental health issues. Watching someone you love slowly fade away, unsure of how to help them, is one of the hardest trials to endure. I decided that the only right step was to seek professional help. We went to a clinic that dealt with both physical and mental health issues. There, Morgan was diagnosed with severe depression. Even though I had a general understanding of depression, hearing those words from the doctor made the world around me feel dull and grim. The doctor explained that the best way to cope with depression is to identify and address its root cause. However, in Morgan's case, this proved to be a difficult task. He had worked at the same factory for many years, and up until now, he had never had any issues. There hadn't been any significant changes at work, and I began to fear that perhaps our marriage had somehow contributed to his condition. During our conversations with the doctor, I tried to assure him that everything was fine at home, that we lived a peaceful, contented life, and I hadn't noticed any obvious stressors that could have caused the depression. The doctor advised us to return if we noticed any new symptoms or if reasons emerged that could explain Morgan's state. Over time, Morgan's suffering became more evident, and his depression grew deeper and more severe. On his worst days, he could barely find the strength to get out of bed. He often complained of headaches that plagued him from morning to night. Sometimes he would call into work, saying he couldn't come due to feeling unwell, and gradually, his illnesses began to take a toll on his body. His appetite disappeared, he lost a lot of weight, and eventually, he had to leave his job because he could no longer handle his responsibilities. Morgan felt an overwhelming sense of guilt for placing all the financial burden on my shoulders, but I tried to reassure him that his health was my top priority. Watching him suffer day in and day out was unbearable. I constantly worried about him, especially when I was at work. My anxiety reached its peak after one incident that made me question whether Morgan's issue was solely depression. One day, he left the house but couldn't find his way back. This event added a new layer of concern. Perhaps he was not only battling depression but also the early stages of dementia. This thought tore me apart inside, heightening my stress even further. When colleagues asked how things were at home, I had to admit that Morgan wasn't getting any better. Seeing the person you love steadily spiral into darkness was endlessly painful, especially when there was no clear plan for how to help. On one of those particularly tough days, when I felt especially down, my manager Douglas noticed. He came over and handed me an energy drink. That gesture, so simple and kind, touched me deeply. I felt a sense of relief, not from the drink itself, but from the care and support he showed. Douglas reminded me that we're all going through our own trials, and his words nearly brought me to tears. I hadn't realized how much stress had accumulated in me over these months and years of caring for Morgan. I understood that if I didn't take control of myself, I might break too. With this in mind, I decided to fully immerse myself in work, trying to maintain some semblance of a normal life. Work provided a distraction, helping me keep my sanity. But despite my efforts, the situation at home remained unchanged, and as our third anniversary approached, the marriage began to feel more and more fragile. Morgan's condition continued to worsen, and I could no longer see any light at the end of this seemingly endless tunnel. One morning, as I was getting ready for work, I suddenly noticed that our car was missing. It wasn't in its usual spot in front of the house. At first, I was puzzled, thinking I might be mistaken. I checked again, but the car was nowhere to be seen. Ever since Morgan's diagnosis, I had been the only one driving the car, as his condition no longer allowed him to drive. I hadn't used the car the previous evening, which meant it should have been there. A growing sense of dread rose inside me. I hurried to Morgan and asked if he knew what had happened to the car. He casually mentioned that he thought it had been there when he returned home the night before. I strained my memory and recalled that he had indeed gone outside briefly while I was at work. The doctor had recommended that he take walks or go jogging as a way to manage his depression. If the car had been there when he returned, that meant it had gone missing sometime during the night. I had no choice but to take public transportation to work. This unexpected change caused me to be 10 minutes late. I explained the situation to Douglas, who, as always, was understanding, though puzzled by the disappearance of the car. Douglas suggested that perhaps Morgan had somehow taken the car, but I dismissed the idea. Given my husband's state, his recent aversion to driving since his illness, the thought seemed absurd. Yes, Morgan had experienced memory lapses, and his mood often shifted, but even so, I couldn't imagine him driving in his condition. The mysterious disappearance of the car added yet another layer of stress to our already challenging situation. Without wasting any time, I reported the car's disappearance to the police, hoping they would find it as soon as possible. But deep down, troubling doubts gnawed at me. Everything seemed too strange, too unexpected. I couldn't shake the feeling that the car might be gone for good, like something slipping away from our already beleaguered world. However, this was only the beginning of the misfortunes that awaited me that day. When I went to the bank to withdraw some money from my personal account, I was met with another blow. I found out that there wasn't a single penny left in my account. It was a complete shock. Morgan and I had a joint account, but we had always used it together, and I was sure he didn't have access to my personal account. To confirm my fears, I checked our joint account, and what I saw left me in shock. There was nothing left there either. At that moment, I felt a cold wave of fear and confusion wash over me. I was stunned. All our savings, the little funds I had carefully put aside, had vanished without a trace. When I got home, I immediately confronted Morgan. His distant gaze, staring off into space, was alarmingly empty. I asked him directly if he knew what had happened to the money in our joint account. His genuinely confused expression and complete denial that he knew anything about the missing funds only deepened my anxiety. I understood that his condition was a fragile balance between depression and what might have been the early stages of dementia. And though my heart ached to find answers, I didn't dare to push further. Each new question could only add to his stress, and I feared breaking his already fragile psyche. But even in his silent stupor, in his contemplative stare, I began to suspect that he might have had something to do with the money's disappearance. As much as I didn't want to admit it, his behavior stirred troubling thoughts I couldn't simply brush aside. I decided to discuss the issue with the police, but at that moment, I was overwhelmed by the depth of the pit we were falling into. The disappearance of the car and the money struck us like a double blow from a hammer, forcing me to realize just how dire our situation had become. Our financial situation was now so precarious that it was hard for me to even think about the future. As if that wasn't enough, the doctors at the clinic we had visited earlier admitted that they could no longer provide Morgan with the necessary care. They recommended transferring him to a larger hospital with better resources and a broader range of treatments. The small local psychiatric clinic we had first turned to had exhausted its capabilities. The doctors gave us a referral to a large general hospital, and Morgan and I decided not to waste any time heading there for our first visit. The taxi ride felt long and difficult. The whole way, I felt a dull anxiety, while Morgan sat beside me, lost in his thoughts, silent and detached, as if his mind were somewhere far beyond this reality. When we finally arrived at the hospital, I took a deep breath, feeling the anxiety and fear of the unknown rising inside me. Handing over the referral letter at the reception desk, I felt vulnerable, as if I was truly grasping the scale of this new trial for the first time. We sat in the crowded hospital lobby, waiting for our turn. Around us, people were absorbed in their own worries and troubles. The buzz of voices and the hum of hospital corridors filled the space. We waited for about an hour. When Morgan was finally called in for his consultation, I decided to pass the time with a book, but as soon as he entered the doctor's office, a nurse approached me. Shyly but politely, she asked, "Are you Mrs. Simmons?" I nodded affirmatively, assuming that, as always, it was about my husband's condition and the doctor wanted to discuss his treatment. The nurse invited me to follow her, and a slight unease crept over me. Everything seemed too formal and serious. She led me to another room, where I was met by a doctor, a man in his 50s, with graying temples and a gentle, kind gaze. Before I even sat down, I immediately asked if this concerned Morgan's condition, and the doctor nodded, but his serious expression didn't bode well. I braced myself to hear something terrible about the progression of his illness, expecting the worst, but what came next was neither worse nor better. It was something entirely different, shattering my understanding of the man I had shared my life with. The doctor, taking a deep breath, advised me to distance myself from Morgan. His next words struck me like lightning. Morgan had been arrested for fraud 10 years ago. My mind spun, overwhelmed by confusion and despair. How was this possible? Why was this coming up now, during a routine medical visit? The doctor, noticing my shock, quickly explained that his suspicions about Morgan's depression weren't random. He suggested that Morgan might be faking his condition, using it as a cover for something more sinister. The doctor told me that he had recognized Morgan as soon as he saw the scar on his right leg. It turned out he was the same doctor who had treated Morgan 10 years ago when he came in with a deep cut on his leg. This revelation hit me to the core. I had always known Morgan had a scar, but he had never told me how he got it. And now, the terrible truth was laid bare. The wound had been inflicted during a fight with his ex-wife, sparked by the fact that Morgan had deceived her, stealing her money and luxury items. The doctor continued with a story that seemed incredibly cruel and twisted. Morgan had manipulated his ex-wife, pretending to be ill so she would let her guard down. This cunning plan allowed him to deceive her and gain access to her savings. Now, hearing this, I realized that Morgan's current behavior could be part of the same scheme, a feigned illness to hide his true intentions. The doctor strongly warned me that Morgan could pose a danger to me, and the seriousness of his tone made my heart tighten with fear. I listened, stunned, as the horrifying realization dawned on me that the man I believed to be my loving husband might be someone entirely different. How had I missed this before? Perhaps I was too consumed with my own worries and problems to see Morgan's true nature. Or maybe I simply didn't want to see the truth. The doctor, with kindness but firm seriousness, explained that this might not just be a case of depression, but a deliberate attempt to use his condition as a cover. My thoughts spun in all directions. The doctor's words, which were supposed to bring relief or answers about my husband's health, brought nothing but new horror. I stared at the doctor, feeling as if everything inside me was collapsing. Too much pain and betrayal had come crashing down at once. I tried with all my might to maintain outward composure in Morgan's presence, though inside, a storm of doubt and anxiety raged. Beneath the surface of our ordinary life, I secretly began to formulate a plan that would finally shed light on his true intentions. The first step was installing surveillance cameras around our house to monitor Morgan's actions in my absence. What seemed like an excessive measure at first soon became a key piece in uncovering his double life. About a week passed after the cameras were installed when I noticed my watch and an expensive handbag were missing from the house. Alarmed, I rushed to check the camera footage, and what I saw shook me to my core. On the screen, I watched as Morgan calmly left the house, holding my belongings, and later returned with a wad of cash in hand. His face was lit up with a strange smile, an expression of pleasure and smug satisfaction that didn't match the image of a man suffering from deep depression. This episode shattered all my illusions and confirmed my worst fears. Morgan was the one who had stolen my possessions, my car, and my savings. The realization of his betrayal made my heart ache with pain. The man I had trusted, the man I had devoted my life to, had been manipulating my emotions all along. He had pretended to be vulnerable and in need of care, only to exploit my compassion and generosity for his own selfish gain. It was clear that I could no longer stay by his side. Divorce seemed inevitable, but at that moment, I realized that wouldn't be enough. I wanted more. I wanted Morgan to face justice for his actions, to truly understand the harm he had caused. With a heavy heart, burning with resentment and bitterness, I began the process of filing for divorce. The next day, after carefully completing all the necessary paperwork, I pretended everything was fine and told Morgan I would be out for a bit. I had already taken the day off from work, explaining to my employer that I needed an urgent leave, and headed straight to the police station. There, I told them my story and showed the video recordings, which clearly demonstrated Morgan's deception and theft. At first, the officers were hesitant to act based solely on the footage, but after checking with a pawn shop where Morgan had sold my items and finding that my car had been listed for sale as a used vehicle, the situation shifted. The evidence against Morgan began piling up one piece after another. It soon became clear that he had also gained illegal access to my bank accounts, and there were growing suspicions that his depression might have been nothing but an act. As the full truth came to light, I felt a complicated mix of emotions, relief that his lies had been exposed, but also deep sadness that the man I loved had turned out to be such a fraud. The police, realizing the extent of the fraud and taking into account Morgan's criminal history, began acting decisively. They made the decision to arrest him immediately. That same day, when Morgan returned home, I was waiting for him with the police. His face turned pale when he saw me at the door, and behind me, the officers. He was visibly terrified by my unexpected presence and the sight of law enforcement. Even the divorce papers I held in my hand didn't catch his attention. He was completely consumed by fear of what was coming. One of the officers calmly but firmly informed Morgan that he was being arrested for fraud. Morgan fiercely protested, trying to use his depression as his final defense, but I already knew the truth. The conversation with the General Hospital doctor had clarified many things. His suspicions about Morgan's mental state were backed by facts I could no longer ignore. At that moment, as Morgan faced not only the consequences of his legal transgressions but also the end of our marriage, the carefully constructed facade he had built began to crack. What seemed like inescapable depression was revealed to be a cunning game, woven with lies and manipulations. Taking such drastic measures was incredibly difficult for me, but the need to protect myself and seek justice for his betrayal outweighed all doubts. I could no longer remain a hostage to his tricks, being used as a pawn in his schemes. Reflecting on my recent visit to the doctor, I couldn't help but think about how easily Morgan had convinced people of his fabricated suffering. The doctor had told me he had already witnessed a similar scheme before. Morgan had faked dementia to deceive his ex-wife, and now, years later, this story seemed to be repeating itself with me. Despite all of this, Morgan remained defiant. In front of the police, he arrogantly denied all accusations, as if his long history of deceit and fraud had prepared him for this moment. His confidence seemed almost insane, especially given that the police already had enough evidence to arrest him. His reaction made it clear that manipulation was second nature to him, and the gravity of the situation was just another test of his mastery of lies. For 4 long years, he deceived me, used my trust, and stole not only my material possessions but, most importantly, my peace and sense of security. Yet, what shocked me the most were his twisted accusations that I was to blame for everything that happened, that I was too trusting. He didn't even try to hide his contempt, as if the entire situation was not his fault but a result of my naivety. His strange boldness, with which he challenged me, ultimately broke the last remnants of my patience. I could no longer remain silent. My resolve strengthened, and I loudly declared my intention to seek legal assistance, demand alimony, and pursue justice. My words, spoken with such confidence, seemed to pierce through the armor he had built around himself. Even the officers present seemed surprised by my outburst of emotion. But that moment appeared to shake Morgan's arrogance. For the first time, I saw his smugness give way to confusion. When the police put handcuffs on him, his defiant behavior crumbled. The face that once expressed challenge and now appeared defeated and disappointed. Watching them lead him away, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were witnessing a scene from someone else's life. The doctor's words resurfaced in my mind, making me feel as though all of this was happening not to me, but in some distant, foreign world. But reality was relentless. I stood face to face with the harsh truth of my life, of the person I once loved and trusted. As I watched Morgan being taken away by the police, I felt a wave of relief. The moment of truth had finally arrived. This turning point meant liberation from his manipulations, from the constant anxiety and doubts that had tormented me for years. And yet, despite the joy of newfound freedom, a shadow of loneliness loomed on the horizon of my future. I had waited 47 years to get married, to find someone who would be my life partner, and now I was returning to solitude once again, which, despite all its freedom, felt painfully familiar. 2 months passed, and our divorce was finally finalized. The process took a bit longer than I had anticipated due to Morgan's arrest and the legal procedures that followed. However, by the time everything was officially settled, my emotions had faded. I didn't feel pain or regret so much as emptiness, like after a violent storm when there is no anger or tears left. I could only hope that this experience would lead Morgan to reconsider his life and actions. Our marriage, which once seemed like a solid foundation, had crumbled, leaving behind only disappointment and hollow memories. I found myself increasingly lost in thoughts about the future, especially during breaks at work when I was alone with my mind. One day at lunch, as I habitually sat in the office cafeteria, my boss, Douglas, casually approached and joined me with a hot dog in hand. His appearance didn't surprise me. Douglas was always easy to talk to, but this time, his comment caught me off guard. "I think you'll be fine if you stick around with me," he said so casually that I didn't immediately grasp the seriousness of his words. But their hidden meaning slowly began to sink in, like a warm breeze unexpectedly brushing against my face. I froze, trying to hide my surprise, but inside I felt those words settle within me, filling my soul with a confusing mix of emotions and even a bit of excitement. Seeing my confusion, Douglas added with a light smirk, but with clear sincerity, "I mean it." His tone was calm, yet earnest, as if the words came from someone who had thought long and hard about his offer. I was stunned. Everything I knew about Douglas, his kindness and reliability, suddenly took on new dimensions. I felt as if I had lost my voice, forgetting even about my lunch, which lay untouched at the edge of my plate as I processed what I had just heard. Douglas soon returned to his work, leaving me alone with my thoughts. His proposal, unexpected and almost fantastical, felt like more than just a gesture of sympathy. It was an entire opportunity that had suddenly opened before me. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about his words. They echoed in my mind. I had never looked at Douglas through the lens of potential romantic interest. To me, he had always been just a colleague, a dependable, confident leader, someone with a strong sense of responsibility and invaluable support. But now, his constant presence in my life, his care, which I had previously taken for granted, began to reveal themselves in a new light. Soon, I found myself feeling not just gratitude when I thought of him, but a kind of warm, almost tender feeling. The idea of inviting him to dinner made my heart beat a little faster, and in these fantasies, a spark of hope for the future began to form. This was a new possibility, one that had once seemed too bold, too far removed from reality. But now, as my life finally started to emerge from the shadow of a broken marriage, I allowed myself to dream of something more, of a happiness I thought I would never find again. The thought of stepping outside my comfort zone, of taking a step towards a new relationship with someone who had always been there, felt both terrifying and exhilarating. But in this new possibility, there was so much warmth and comfort that I couldn't help but heed the call. That evening, I decided that perhaps this moment could be the start of something new and beautiful in my life.